out on this snowy morning. We appreciate that. And thank you especially for arriving as early as you did. You can see the purpose of that, so we were able to get you all in before 10 o'clock. Thank you for coming. And the Planning Committee joins me in reminding you that we have announcements on the tables. If this happens to be your first bucket course, the orange sheets on the table kind of tell you what the routine is for Wednesday morning. And it also explains the snow day. Besides that, the most important announcement that's on the sheet is to please silence your cell phone. So if you haven't done that yet, please do so. I'm starting out with good news this morning. Even though George's course has been advertised as being a 4-week course, it will be a 5-week course. So no extra charge to you. So plan on that on your schedules that it will be for 5 weeks. I hope you can all come for that. And just about the time you think the bucket courses can't possibly get any better, the master returns. George Drake is Professor Emeritus of History at Grinnell College, and we are delighted to respond to your many requests to have him come back. And he is offering the course in the Constitution from origin to implementation. So please give a very warm winter welcome to Professor George Drake.
Get this on now. How is the sound back in the back? Is it okay? It's okay. All right. Good. Well, I add my thanks to Joanne's for your coming out for this. I'm very excited to see what's going to happen. Every other course that I've taught as a bucket course, I've also taught on campus in one form or another. And I've not taught a course on the Constitution. I'm hardly an authority on the Constitution, but I've gotten very interested in it of late. I have to confess that when I was a student at Grinnell College, I was a history major, and I never took a single American history course. Joe Wall was my advisor, and when we came up against comprehensives, which were half American history, I was worried. And he says, "How was it that you didn't take any American history?" I said, "I don't know, you're my advisor." But I was totally invested in European history. Those were the only alternatives back in Grinnell in those days. European, Western European, or American history, that was it. So we had a truncated curriculum, and I truncated even more. But of late, I'd say the last 3 or 4 years, I've gotten exceedingly interested in American history, and most of my reading is in that area, and I've gotten particularly interested in the Constitution. I did a little teaching of the Constitution in my course from Europe to America, where American democratic institutions were part of that. But it's from that moment 3 or 4 years ago that this interest has developed. So, as I say, I'm interested to see how this will go. But I'm excited about doing it. You have these pocket constitutions as a handout. I want to speak a little bit about each of the handouts. And I have a letter here from the ACLU. I want to give them full credit. And we are all, yeah, okay. So here's what they said. "Dear Mr. Drake, the ACLU is most happy to provide you with our pocket constitutions for your students, as we firmly believe in the benefits of introducing everyone to the foundational documents of our nation. The mission of the ACLU is to preserve the protections and guarantees provided for in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The ACLU is our nation's guardian of liberty, working daily in courts, legislatures, communities to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties that the Constitution and the laws of the United States guarantee everyone in this country. We commend you for using these booklets to help teach your students about our country and our rights. Thanks again for getting in touch." Anyway, these were free. This is what the ACLU will do. It's one of the many services they provide, and they certainly deserve our thanks for doing that, because it would be hard to teach this course without having the Constitution in front of us. Now, you can all go online and get a copy, but this is a very convenient form to have it. Now, I have my pocket Constitution here, and when we get onto it, I've got lots of little notes in the margins to sort of help with the kinds of explanations that I think we'll need. And that will, my plan, we're having 5 of these lectures instead of 4. We had a little difficulty finding someone for that snow day, which would have been the 5th, but is the 5th lecture, and so I said, okay, you know I always fall behind. So, and I'm hoping that we can have plenty of discussion, so I'll extend this out, sort of a favor to me actually, to extend it out into 5 days. So what I want to do is give you a little introduction now, and then today we'll do 2 things, and they have to do with particularly the handouts that you have in front of you. One of them, which you wonder, why does it stop in mid-sentence virtually? That's this, Our Broken Constitution by Jeffrey Toobin in the December 9th, 2013, New Yorker. It's an extraordinarily good essay on the Constitution and the issues that confront us today as we try to make an 18th century document appropriate for 21st century conditions. And I'm going to spend a little time on the sections that are here. You won't have time to read that now, but take it home with you and read it in your leisure. Then if you get really interested in what's next in the article, like get the New Yorker and finish. You've got about half of the article. This is sort of a fair use kind of thing I'm trying to do, not to Xerox all of an article and hand it out to 90 or so people. But we'll spend a little time on this today, and then we will start with the Constitution itself. Now this is where I've got my fingers crossed. We're going to plow through the Constitution. Article by article, section by section, and we'll look at many of the amendments, many of the 27th amendments. We'll obviously not finish that today, and it will take up, I think, the bulk of our time in the second of the lecture. Then, in the third of the lectures, we'll actually look at the making of the Constitution. The fact that we had a Constitution already, the Articles of Confederation, which were formed in 1777 while we're fighting the Revolutionary War, and finally adopted by all of the 13 states. They had, in the case of the Articles of Confederation, it required all of the states to adopt it, and that happened when Maryland agreed in 1781. So you had really a 4-year span where it's kind of a constitution, and maybe not, because it had not been formally adopted by all 13 of the states. So we'll look at the Articles of Confederation and what the problems that they created. They really were that. Madison described them as a treaty among the states, not really a union. And it was the only thing that really that united the states was the common foe, England, and fighting the Revolution. And even then they weren't entirely united. But absent the Revolution, the states had all sorts of, you couldn't raise any money for the federal government without approval from the states. They needed the money. They didn't want to give it to the federal government. So the federal government was starved for funds, that sort of thing. Didn't have a president, didn't have a judiciary. They didn't want another king. Were very anti-executive leadership and so on. So it had a lot of problems with them. And we'll look at that and the movement that comes to reform the Articles of Confederation. That's in the third lecture. The Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia from May through September of 1787 was a massive double cross. Their mandate from the Congress was to reform and change the Articles. They throw out the Articles and start over with a new Constitution. And so they were exceeding their mandate, and when we come to ratification, that's one of the main charges levied at the Constitution. It's illegal. You can't do that. You exceeded the mandate. So that we'll look at the Constitutional Convention in some detail on that third Wednesday. Then the fourth Wednesday, we'll look at the ratification process. Now, here they have managed to pull together a document and to agree on it. 55 people came to the convention, only 39 signed. A lot of them drop out, and 3, and we'll get into that, 3 who attended right straight through refused to sign. So can they get 9 states? They need 9 states to ratify. And there's a huge controversy about that within the states. And a lot of that is focused on the state of New York. where the governor, Clinton, was anti-constitutional, and it looked like a nip-and-tuck thing to bring New York along. And so Alexander Hamilton organizes a series of newspaper articles to support and justify the Constitution. And he gets James Madison and John Jay to help him in that process, and the result is the Federalist Papers. The 85 different articles that appeared that are now regarded as one of the great political theory documents in the Western world. But there also were anti-federalists, and they're writing articles too. So we have the anti-federalist papers, and as I said in my introduction last week, if you want to find the Tea Party, go to the anti-federalists, the ones who are against the Constitution, not the ones that are for it. Because the ones who are for it are the ones who want a strong national government. The ones who are against it want strong states' rights and individual rights. And so that will occupy us most of that fourth lecture, looking at that process, the argument between the Federalists and anti-federalists. Then in the fifth lecture, we'll look at the early national period and the formation of the government, and then some of the themes that lead up to the Civil War and through the Civil War. In a way, what we were as a nation had huge centrifugal forces pulling us apart. Think of it for a minute. These are 13 independent colonies whose ties are not, essentially political ties are not to each other, they're vertical ties to the mother country, separate, different charters between the colonies and the mother country. What do they have in common? They're located on the same continent, along the coast, east coast of the same continent. They are in common colonials from the British Empire. Well, they have economic relationships with each other, but they're very different. They're different in size. The largest of the states, Virginia, had a population 11 times the population of Delaware or Rhode Island. Rhode Island did not even attend the Constitutional Convention. They thought, this is a losing game. There's no way we, little Rhode Island, can have any impact or influence, so we're not even going. So they never do go. They eventually ratify it, but they don't go to the convention. You've got big differences in interest, north and south. The southern colonies are different from the northern colonies. The southern colonies have an economy that is dependent on slavery. The northern colonies have slaves, but they're domestic slaves, and they are gradually disappearing. They're not, by any stretch of the imagination, essential. Actually, the first part of the United States to declare independence from slavery, make an outlaw, is Vermont. Now, Vermont's not one of the 13 original states, but during the Revolution, the Green Mountain Boys staged their own separate revolution, and Vermont becomes its own independent entity. And they outlaw slavery. They, in 1791, decide to join the United States. They're one of 4 of our states, Texas, California, Vermont, and I forget the other one, that were once independent countries apart from the United States. But Vermont comes in as the 14th state in 1791. But they're the first, that's the first area to actually outlaw slavery. So you've got free versus slave, north versus south, large states versus small states, agricultural interests versus manufacturing and commercial interests. The north, again, that's part of a north-south division. The south is predominantly agricultural. The north is heavily agricultural, but also lots of commerce and industry. So they're different on issues of tariff. The north wants big tariffs, the south wants no tariffs in order to cheapen the goods that they're buying from the British and others. So these are the kinds of major issues that confront this convention, as we'll see in a few moments when we look at the Tubin article. The biggest one that they deal with is large state, small state. They finesse slavery. No way we would have been a nation at that time if slavery had been outlawed, because the South wouldn't have joined the Union. And you know, as we know, in the second half of the 19th century, they tried to leave the Union over the issue of slavery. So we've never had it. So they have to, we'll look at that in the Constitution, the ways in which it's finessed. And one of the things we'll find when we look at the Constitution is that what we have here as the original Constitution is the original, unamended. Then the amendments deal with sections of the Constitution. We'll have to go back and forth a little bit when we look at the amendments. But the Constitution as we have it is as it was originally written. For example, the 3/5 clause, where slaves are counted as 3/5. Of course, they're in our Constitution right now. But that's done away with the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. So the total Constitution is really the original document and the amendments that changed the document. So one of the themes of this course will be this centrifugal force, that we are a nation. We're bound by the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Gulf with a very long land border with Canada, the luckiest border I guess we have in the world almost. It's been a very easy border. And then the border with Mexico. So yeah, as a geographic entity, it's not too hard to define the United States of America. But if you begin to look at the interests that are here in this continent, then there are tremendous forces pulling us apart. Texas still talking about seceding from the Union. The two coasts. If we'll look at a few moments at the great compromise that creates the Senate with each state with 2 senators. Now you can see that's a protection for the small state, the least populous state. A state like Wyoming, 2 senators, 1 representative. Today, Wyoming is the smallest state in population. The largest state, California, is 70 times greater than the state of Wyoming. Yet, Wyoming has as many senators as California. And the issue, one of the things that explored in this Broken Constitution article, is that if Madison and others had had their way, and that both chambers in the bicameral legislature represented population, the 2 coasts would run the country. You look at the electoral map, and if you just looked at the map, you'd say, wow, the Republicans have dominated this country. It's red all over the middle of the country. Just occasional states, blue states that crop up in the middle of the country or in the south. So if you were representing a geographic area, Republicans have got it hands down, the red states hands down. But there are these blue concentrations in urban parts of red states, and then there's heavily blue concentrations in places like New York and California. And what conservatives argue today, if we didn't have the Senate the way it is, well, the coast would run everything, and we in the middle would have no voice whatsoever, because we don't have the population to compete with those areas. Centrifugal forces. And the parts of this article that we will not look at today, but that are there in the New Yorker, are the ways in which the issues explored in the first half, which are more definitely related to the Constitution, have been playing out in our politics today. And anyway, we'll get to that in a few moments. So there are these issues of centrifugal forces that are pushing against the Constitution and our Union. And yet, we revere our Constitution. We think of it as almost like the Bible. And indeed, you have constitutional fundamentalists on the Supreme Court and all over the place who say we cannot deviate at all from what these 18th century founding fathers put there and intended to be there. Now, we don't deviate from what's put there in a sense. In other words, when the Supreme Court rules on the constitutionality of a law, they are related back to a clause of the Constitution. But how do you interpret that clause? Necessary and proper. We'll come to that. The necessary and proper clause in Article 1 of the Constitution. That the government can do what is necessary and proper to enforce the laws. Well, what's necessary and proper? So there's wiggle room in the Constitution, and how fundamentalist or originalist can you be? But people who are, again, worried about minority rights tend toward the originalist position. Those who want a more active federal government doing things, changing things, tend not to be originalists, but saying this is a living document, has to be a living document in order to move from 18th century environment into the 21st century environment. Just imagine what the architects of the Constitution would have to think about with today's communication. And what it's done to our politics, where you can't really say anything that isn't totally thought through, because it's going to be all over in the press, on Twitter, you name it, and it's going to be used against you. So the kinds of strains that are put on politicians today to function within that constitutional structure are quite remarkable. Well, having said that, let me say a little bit more about this article by Jeffrey Toobin. And one of the things that Toobin does at the beginning of the article is to talk about this iconic, almost spiritual status that the Constitution tends to occupy. For example, in our collective consciousness. For example, one of the first things the Tea Party did when those folks came into Congress in 2010 and said, we got up there and they're reading the Constitution. Nobody ever pays attention to the Constitution anymore. We're going to read it. And that irony of the Tea Party folks today being the strongest constitutionalists of all. And as I say, when we look at the anti-federalist arguments, we have to, I think, conclude inevitably they would have been against the Constitution originally. It's just creates too much power with the federal government. Ted Cruz, for example, is quoted in this article saying, "The founding fathers fought, bled for freedom, and then crafted the most miraculous political document ever conceived, our Constitution." On the other side, Barack Obama is quoted as saying, "Conservative or liberal, we are all constitutionalists." Or another quote that Toobin uses, the outline, this is Obama. Remember, Obama was for 10 years at the University of Chicago Law School, a professor of constitutional law. That's his academic field, constitutional law. And here's what Obama said, "The outlines of Madison's constitutional architecture are so familiar that even school children can recite them. Not only the rule of law and representative government, not just the Bill of Rights, but also the separation of the national government into 3 co-equal branches, a bicameral Congress, and a concept of federalism that preserved authority in state governments, all of it designed to diffuse power, check factions, balance interests, and prevent tyranny by either the few or the many." So clearly, Obama believes it struck a nice balance. And it is, as we'll see, an extraordinary balance, because there aren't very many nations where the federal government doesn't have a lot of control over the subdivisions of government. But remember, the states created the federal government. They were there first. And they all had constitutions before the federal Constitution. And so it's a question in our origins, how much power do the states give up to a federal government, and how much do they retain for themselves? How much does their fear of what would happen if they don't hang together influence what they're going to allow to happen at the federal level? So we truly are a federal structure. There are a lot of things the federal government can't do that belong to the states. And states' rights are very powerful. So it's a complicated soup that we've created politically. Well, Toobin goes on to say in the article, there are these sorts of questions that the Constitution have not finally resolved. How insulated should elected officials be from the demands of the people? We know the House of Representatives elected every 2 years. There was a lot of discussion at the Constitutional Convention. It should be only 1-year terms. And the Articles of Confederation said you had 1-year term in Congress, and in a period of 6 years you could only serve 3. All kinds of limitations. That's in order to make sure you've got turnover and people are listening, our representatives are listening to us. We are a republic. We're not a direct democracy. We don't all make policy. We elect people to make policy for us. How much control should we have in it? You know, if we were to take a poll in this room and say there's too much listening to the public, and then our representatives don't use their minds at all, they just sort of do polls and tests and find out what the popular opinion is, and then they're going to follow it. And we think our representatives, many of us, I have to be one, should have a little more independence from us. But how much independence should there be? And that's not clearly defined in our Constitution. Or how should power be divided between federal and state governments? We've already talked about that. Or how should the rights of individuals be protected from the claims of government? At the Constitutional Convention, the general interpretation is that, and I think it's correct, is that representatives were a little more worried about states' rights than they were about individual rights. They were, after all, representatives of their state. Yet, the so-called spirit of 1776, Patrick Henry, we'll see, is one of the chief opponents of the Constitution. Give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry. Several times governor of Virginia, the sort of elder statesman of the Virginia group. He's older than any of them, been around proclaiming liberty longer than any of them. He didn't like the Constitution one bit. It overrode the spirit of 1776 of individual liberty. There's not enough protection in the Constitution. We'll see. The Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists argued vociferously against the Constitution because it has no Bill of Rights. The Virginia Constitution had a wonderful Bill of Rights, and in fact, Madison cribs from the Virginia Constitution when he puts together the Bill of Rights. What had to happen was the Constitutionalists had to say, yeah, a Bill of Rights is coming, we'll do it. Let's get this thing approved, and then we'll get on to the Bill of Rights, which is what happened. 1791, all 10 of the First Amendments are passed. So they knew the Bill of Rights was coming. But it was easy to argue against the Constitution. We don't trust them. They say they're going to do a Bill of Rights. Where is it? Why wasn't it there in the first place? And I suspect they sort of ran out of steam in Philadelphia. It was a hot summer, and to go into the whole issue of the Bill of Rights would have taken them another 3 or 4 months to come up with the answer. So anyway, Tubin talks about a constitutional lawyer named Sandy Levinson from the University of Texas, who visited the display in 1987 at the bicentennial of the Constitution in Philadelphia, where people were asked, would you approve the Constitution or not, if you had been there? And Levinson's, in discussion with Tubin, says, well, I had to think a lot about that. Because after all, when you look at the Constitution, no Bill of Rights, slavery is protected, many states have a property franchise. When we look at the Constitution, the franchise is controlled by states. It still is. That's one of those states' rights that's been preserved. And, you know, what we're worried now about, at least I am, about North Carolina, and all the things they're doing to limit the number of people who can vote. And the Voting Rights Act has been gutted by the Supreme Court because there's now no real enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. So states are now free to alter their election procedures. It rests with the states. And the franchise, what it says in the Constitution, the franchise shall be the same as it is in the state for the election of the largest body of the legislature. That's the constitutional basis. Well, at the time the Constitution was adopted, more states had franchise requirements. You had to own property in order to vote. So would you have approved the Constitution, that being the case? Women could not vote. Would you approve the Constitution without women being able to vote? The delegates at the convention were more interested in states' rights than in rights of individual people. So this was the question that Levinson raised. He says, well, at the time I said yes, I would still have passed it. But he says, now I would say no. And that actually what Levinson is worried about is the way the government's functioning today. And he thinks that the Constitution is not strong enough to prevent dysfunction in our government, and that the dysfunction we have today is partly, or should be primarily laid at the Constitution's door rather than at individuals' door. So the article then gets into the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise at the convention was the decision to allow the Senate to be 2 senators from each state rather than the basis of popular sovereignty. We'll see that James Madison is the primary architect of the Constitution. He's the architect because he devises a thing called the Virginia Plan. They come in on the first day of the convention, and that becomes the agenda. They present it. You know, they don't know what they're going to do. And here are these Virginia folks working away. They were meeting at Mount Vernon with Washington and so on. And Madison was putting this plan together. He didn't present it. Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, presented it, but it was Madison's plan. The Virginia plan shapes all of the discussion of the convention. And Madison wanted popular sovereignty everywhere. And he was dead set against this Great Compromise. But ultimately, the small state said, without that, no Constitution. We won't vote yes. And you can understand that. They felt overwhelmed by Virginia, by Pennsylvania, by New York, among other states. And we'll see when we look at the Constitution, there is a section in there about how many representatives they'll have in the states. You can see the disparity in the House of Representatives. Even then, of course, even greater disparities today. We in Iowa are acutely aware of that as we gradually lose representatives in the House of Representatives. So that compromise is what allows the Constitution to go forward. And then what Tubin does in the rest of the article is to discuss how that compromise plays out in contemporary politics. And the general thesis is, and it doesn't look very contemporary right now, but the Senate represents a more conservative force than the House. The House represents the most immediate feelings of the country, majority feeling of the country. So will the majority rule? Or will the minority have ability to cool things off, which the majority wants to do, and at least cause a second look at it, or maybe even stop it? George Washington described the Senate as the saucer in which the boiling water is poured and then it cools. The question is, will it freeze? But think back in most of our lifetimes of what the Senate was able to do to preserve Jim Crow. At that time, the Senate was, from the Southern representatives and senators, were Democrats. And the Democratic Party was the protector of slavery, and the Republican Party, Lincoln's party, was not. And therefore, Democrats keep getting elected over and over and over again, and they assume committee chairmanships and so on because of seniority, and they were able to stop civil rights in its track in the Senate, where you get some shifts in the House of Representatives. That's just one example. Or the Senate stops the League of Nations from happening, even though the majority will of the country was that we should have it. In the article, Tubin does describe what he says. Barack Obama's rule or reign as president lasted for 1.5 years. When Al Franken was elected to the Senate had 60 Democrats. House at that time was Democratic, and the president. So all three of those major bodies were Democratic, and a lot of things that happened then, including the Affordable Care Act. But he does this. It's actually fairly impressive what they were able to accomplish in 1.5 years. Since then, virtually nothing. As that balance of power has shifted. Now it happens at the present, it's not the Senate predominantly, though with its rules, and we'll see in the Constitution, each house can make up its own rules. These are not constitutional, created, they are allowed by the Constitution. So you have the 60-vote rule in the Senate, which now has been compromised slightly by the so-called nuclear option with respect to presidential appointments. And that also Tubin gets into it in the latter part of the article. But then Tubin, and this is in a lot of it's in what you have before you, talks with various constitutional teachers of constitutional law to get their opinions. And someone like Levinson, who was a progressive, says we should do away with our Constitution and create something like the European parliamentary state. Then you can do things. Why? Because the executive in the European Parliament represents the majority of the Parliament. So you've got an immediate tie between the executive and the legislature, and you can get things done. You can. So that's the direction Levinson would go. And then Tubman interviews several very conservative constitutional lawyers who think that the current Constitution allows way too much power for the majority and not enough of preservation of minority rights and way too much power to the Supreme Court. And so they come up with various amendments that they would make a Constitution. I'll just read some of those. Congressional term limits, we've heard that one. 3/5 of the states can overrule any federal legislation. So the states. Now, interestingly, that turns Madison's view on its head. In the Virginia plan, Madison wanted the federal government to be able to overturn state laws, to review and overturn state laws. Madison, it turns out, at that particular moment in his life, was so fed up with state legislatures, which he felt were full of a bunch of stock jumpers. And it's really the dregs of society. Madison's an aristocrat, and he wants a federal government that will really bear down on those states and get them in line. Now he changes. Under Jefferson's influence, he becomes one of the architects of Jefferson's Republican / Democratic Party. It's very convoluted, the history of our parties. But he wants very much, originally, to come down hard on the states, and later in the politics of America, he becomes a states' rights person, and it's almost wonder if he didn't repudiate his own Constitution. So he makes a dramatic shift. Okay, I'll quickly go through these others, and then we'll take a break. Another of these proposals: half of the Supreme Court justices selected by the President and the Senate, as they are now, and the other half selected by the 50 governors of the states. Now, I don't know how you get half out of 9, but anyway, they may separate, it's not clear in the article, it may separate the Chief Justice from the others. Or Congress, by a 2/3 vote of both houses, can override Supreme Court decisions. Or eliminate the federal income tax, the 16th Amendment, 1913. Or allow half the states, provided they represent at least half the population, to rescind any federal law. That's another way of doing it. That's actually a little more liberal in terms of rescinding than the 2/3 would be. So this is what's going on now, today, with respect to this iconic document that we have. So we'll take a break now, and we'll begin to look at our iconic document. So far I'm on time. I intended to get here before the break.
That's all right.
They don't pay any attention
Shows
to me
reality.
anymore.
I'm recording right now.
Oh, you are?
Reality.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for taking your seat. I hope there was enough Mayflower coffee and cookies for you all. I want to tell you that our planning committee and I just hate to turn anybody away from these courses. But we allow for 90 to register, and you can tell from the room that we are limited to that number. And we let a few in this morning to take the place of some people who weren't able to get here because of the snow. But we try to stick pretty close to those who are registered. However, the good news is that if you aren't able to get in, or if you have somebody who would like to be a part of the bucket courses or hear it and isn't able to get here, you can get a copy of the DVD from the library. You can check it out just like a book. And they are usually available the afternoon of the class. Jack is very good about doing that. And if it isn't there in the afternoon, it certainly will be the next day. You can also purchase a DVD, which would be $5 for each class, $15 for the whole course. And if you have access to Channel 12, you can see the class on there, which comes a week after the class has been given. So those are your other options, and we're delighted that all of you could come this morning, but we do want you to be as comfortable as possible, so that's why we have to limit the number. Yes, sir?
Are the DVDs the same as what you see on Channel 12?
Yes, they are.
Okay. I don't mean any disrespect to our audio man or any of our production people, but the audio is just awful on Channel 12.
That may have, he mentioned that the audio on Channel 12 isn't good. That may depend on your hookup, because what I get is very clear.
Oh, is it?
It's like
Yes.
a movie.
Yeah, to me, it sounds like someone's holding a handkerchief against the
Oh,
phone. You know,
okay.
getting, ransom
no,
message
I
across.
don't get
That may, how about the rest of you? Is it clear?
Oh, yeah, very.
Okay.
Okay, we just need a new TV then.
Yes. Yes, give us a TV, you'll be all
We'll
right.
get a color one.
It's very clear.
But I appreciate your comments, because if you are having a problem, we'd like to know that. And so now we can continue with George Drake's course on the Constitution. Professor Drake.
Get this on, and it isn't.
Is the audio still okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. You always pick up things at the break, and Bob Williams sort of mentioned, he said, when you go to Vermont, it still seems like one of the most democratic states. And then I commented that Vermont has the largest representation in its lower house in relation to population of any of the states. It's a very large legislature in a very small state. So that, sort of thrust has been continued. Carol Nielsen mentions that she's got the New Yorker article, if anyone wants to borrow it. I also have a copy that I'd be willing to loan out, so, I'm sure there are others who could get these things circulated, because it is kind of hard to get into an article halfway through and then it just stops. But it's well worth reading. One thing I did not do in the first half was comment about the bibliography that is on your tables. And let me just mention these very briefly. The Federalist Papers is, and it's a Signet edition, it's very inexpensive, and it's not the kind of thing you'll want to plow through. The introduction is good, but there are certain Federalist Papers, such as number 10 and 51 by Madison, that are exceedingly important and very interesting. But you can sort of sample those and find them, I think, quite interesting. Now, the Anti-Federalist Papers, actually from the point of view of a general audience, not a bunch of historians, though many of you are historians, is, I think, the more useful of these two volumes because the Constitutional Convention debates are there. About 100, how many, Dave Ferguson was reading, where Dave is, but it's 100 and some pages of notes from the Constitutional Convention. Now, this convention, I hinted at it originally, they're double-crossed the Continental Congress. They had closed meetings, and they did not produce official minutes. But James Madison took notes, and then after he finished his second term as president, he sat down and edited his notes, put it all together, and that's the best record we have from the debates of the convention. And the bulk of what's in that volume are Madison's notes. And I think he's pretty straightforward and honest about it, because it certainly represents opposite views pretty correctly, I think. So that, and then it's interesting just to sample some of the Anti-Federalists arguments. And those two volumes are quite inexpensive, probably not much more, about $10 in paperback, or get it online, and it would be even less. The Creation of the American Republic, the third of those books, by Gordon Wood. And Gordon Wood is, among the historians who are active today, the great authority on this period. At Brown, he teaches at Brown University. And that's probably a little heavier going than the other material. It's a monograph on roughly a 12 to 13 year period. What's really, I find the most interesting part of it, it's the one book that really tells you what's going on with the state constitutions, because that's kind of an overlooked subject. When you think about what the founding fathers had to go on, they were Enlightenment men, they were all men, who really did believe that the human intelligence could craft good government. They really did believe in that. That was important. They start with the presupposition, we can do this. It's not beyond our capacity. Then they had the British Constitution, and we'll talk about that when we get into that, I guess the third lecture, to draw on. And interesting enough, they've just been fighting a war against the British, and they kind of won it. I mean, the British just gave up finally, it wasn't worth it. And yet they constantly cite in the convention debates and in the Federalist Papers this wonderful example of the British Constitution, an unwritten constitution, but they draw a lot from Great Britain. They have the state constitutions to work with, and they have the Articles of Confederation, and they incorporate some of the articles in our Constitution. So they've got at least those four sources going for them, and the Enlightenment has produced political theory. Particularly Montesquieu, John Locke to some, but they quote Montesquieu over and over again in the convention and in the Federalist Papers. He is the great guru of how you ought to construct the government. So they have things to go on, and a lot of that is in the Creation of the American Republic. Founding Brothers, the Revolutionary Generation, Joseph Ellis, is a Pulitzer Prize winning book, very, very readable, not particularly long. It's a lot of vignettes about the interaction of these people with each other. Washington is there, Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, Burr, and so on in that book. Madison and Jefferson is a very interesting book about that close relationship. Now, Thomas Jefferson literally has nothing to do with the Constitution. He's in France. And he's appalled at what his buddy James Madison is doing. He is one of those who's really strong on individual rights, and as we know, when he becomes president, there's a huge sort of democratic flow into American government. He's dismantling what these awful federalists who believe in strong, energetic national government has been doing. He wants it to be not so energetic. And he influences Madison once he gets back, and manages to draw Madison a bit away from his own creation. And that's a very interesting relationship. They're very, very close, the two of them. Jefferson, by the way, believed that no constitution shall last more than 19 years. It becomes ossified, and you should start over again. Then the Empire of Liberty, if you want, it's part of the Oxford history of the United States, which goes through the entire history of the United States, and the period from 1789 to 1815, when the nation is being created under the Constitution. It's Gordon Wood. It's a long book. More accessible, I would say, than the Creation of the American Republic, because it's meant to be for general readers and cover a lot of ground. It does so very effectively, but I read it last summer, I think, and it took me a while. It's 700 pages or so to read, but it's a very good book. So and if I think of other things, I will add that to the list of the bibliography. Okay, so we've got about a half hour. Pull out our handy pocket constitution and look at the preamble. That's important, and I'll try to explain why that's important. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The preamble really is hugely important. In the first place, it begins, "We the people." This is Madison. This government should represent people, not states. Because the Articles of Confederation say the Articles of Confederation and perpetual union between the states of New Hampshire, etc. It lists all the states. So the Articles of Confederation are a joining of the states. The Constitution of the United States is "We the people of the United States." So this is the popular sovereignty thrust of James Madison at this point. A more perfect union, and the issue of union keeps coming up. We're used to it in Lincoln's terms. You know, why we have a Civil War, you know, technically to preserve the Union. Was it, you know, to get rid of slavery or not? There's lots of argument there. No doubt it was to preserve the Union. So the Union, in song and the forces of the Union, the Northern armies and so on, it's just in the nomenclature all the way. What surprised me when I started getting interested is how much Union is in the conversation at this time. So union is extremely important. Why a union? For domestic tranquility. In other words, safety and settled life, not disrupted, archaic kind of place. We want the domestic tranquility. After all, they just come through a war. And it's been a very troubled and tumultuous time. They want to settle things down. So the purpose of the Constitution is for tranquility. Provide common defense. That probably is as important as any element in bringing these states together. How are they going to defend themselves if they are separate? They'll hang separately or hang together. British are still in Canada, right on the northern border. The Spanish are in Florida, in the south. The Native Americans are in the west. And we certainly have not settled our relationships with Native Americans as we're moved. There's a lot throng westward thrust. Washington was, for example, was exceedingly interested in westward movement. They're foreseeing this. After all, these states like Virginia were essentially to extend all the way to the Pacific, if you can ever occupy it. And certainly, the reason Virginia, current West Virginia and current Kentucky were settled by Virginians. They're part of Virginia. And then later they're going to become separate states. West Virginia not until the Civil War, but Kentucky fairly early on. So common defense is very much on their minds. And you know, of course, defense is still very much on our minds. We're spending, I guess, about as much as the rest of the world together on defense. So it's still a big part of our constitutional purpose. Promote the general welfare. Now we get into areas of controversy. How active should our federal government be in promoting the general welfare? Should we have Social Security? Should we have health care? Should we guarantee, one of the things we don't guarantee is education. The South African Constitution guarantees education. Built on our Constitution, their Bill of Rights, though, is about 10 pages long, ours is only a couple of 3. But general welfare, there's a constitutional basis for the welfare state. It's here in the Constitution, but how much should the federal government do to promote the general welfare? That's a hugely controversial area. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Okay, the general welfare and liberty conflict. For many, in the minds of many people, it does. Should you pass a helmet law? Now we're at the state level. Well, that interferes with my individual right to go out there and not wear a helmet, get my head bashed in, and then you help pay for it. So these are complicated issues, but liberty versus welfare. It's there in the Constitution, but not resolved, because the two can be antithetical and conflict with each other. And to ourselves and our posterity, and they're definitely thinking of posterity at the convention. This isn't just for themselves, it's for the future. John?
You skipped establishing justice.
Yeah, oh, excuse me. Oh, John had just mentioned that I'm not a very just person. Establish justice. Yeah, what did I underline? I'm going to do it now. The Articles of Confederation had no Supreme Court, no court system whatsoever. It's all gonna be state courts. Now we're saying, within the Constitution, the federal government, there's gonna be some concern for law and order and justice. And so, yes, there it is. Thank you very much, John, for bringing that to all of our attention. Okay, so we are ordaining the Constitution of the United States. Now we can turn the page and Article 1. If I were teaching this on campus, I'd have students reading sections and so on, and we start talking about it. And I think because of the audio things, that I'll probably do the reading, but certainly welcome discussion and questions, because this, you know, the Tea Party folk take the position, you don't need a bunch of constitutional lawyers to interpret the Constitution. There it is, it's simple, you can interpret it. And it's clear to everybody what it means. But I think what we'll find out is that it's not clear to everybody what it means. Eric?
In the preamble, the only noun that is not capitalized is defense. Why is that?
The simple answer is, I don't know. The question is, why is defense not the one that's the others are capitalized? Whenever I look at these things as they were printed, I can never figure out why one thing's capitalized and another isn't. But they do it, and there must be a reason. They were editing the Constitution right up to the last vote. And they had a draft and a vote, and then we'll find in I forget whether it's in one of the, it's in the Constitution at the end, there are some corrections. When they talk about ratification, and there's a whole paragraph on corrections. So, they didn't even send out a clean version it's sort of strange that these corrections are there in the Constitution, but they're there. So I don't know. If anybody has an idea or an answer to that, why, you're welcome to contribute. This is a back and forth. All right, Article 1. Now, the Article 1, as we'll find, is by far the longest article. And there's no doubt that at the time that the Constitution was made, the legislature was regarded as the most important of the three bodies of government that are created. It's the most important in state government. They're coming out of a period when appointed governors by the crown in the colonies had overweening power, often. A lot of the rhetoric against King George is directed actually at their governors. So they have the background of overpowerful governors representing the British government among people who now are for generations independent of Britain, at least geographically. You also have, of course, King George as the symbol for tyranny. So the feeling is that the executive easily translates into tyranny. Less so with the legislatures, though, as I've said before, Madison was concerned about the legislators. But it's just sort of understood that the legislature is the real center of government. And so when you look at the Constitution, we probably won't get through Article 1. You wonder how long will this take, but Article 1 is the most difficult to get through and the longest. When we come to the executive, about half of the Constitution, Article 2 is about how you choose an executive. And at the convention, they're debating, should it be one person, should it be three? No one suggests two. One or three. Should it be for 1 year? Or for 6 years? 7? Or 4? Should the executive be allowed to rerun and become an executive again? Lots of people say, no, then we got a king. The only thing, in my opinion, and many historians' opinions, that allowed this convention to create an executive was George Washington. They knew it would be Washington, and they trusted it. He had already resigned command of the army. He didn't become a Napoleon. Well, Napoleon's yet to be. He didn't become Cromwell. That Cromwell was very much in their mind. The winner, the general, he didn't take over, resigned his commission. He's clearly proven himself to be trustworthy, and he is the most trusted person in America at that time, by far, even with Benjamin Franklin around. So the thought that this would be Washington allows them to create an executive and to give certain power. Look, starts out commander-in-chief. Well, he knows how to be commander-in-chief, he's the general of our army, so they're willing to give that kind of power to their president. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of the story, but you'll feel when we get into Article 2, what is the president, not too much compared to the legislature. So, okay, here we are with Article 1, which is the legislature. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives, so a bicameral legislature. Now, bicameralism was not automatic. Pennsylvania had a unicameral legislature. We know our neighboring state, Nebraska, has a unicameral legislature, so it's not automatic, but they want to, there's this notion of division of powers or balance of powers that is going to run throughout the Constitution. It's better to have two legislative bodies that can counteract each other. You're building in, deliberately building in opportunities to stop things, or to counteract, or to balance. This is a result of compromise, and balance is very important to our Constitution. People are worried about states' rights, states' power, and individual rights. And they're better protected if you have two houses of Congress. And of course, as we'll see, the question of how you make up those two houses and what their role will be. Okay, Section 2, long. We're going to get into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year. Okay, they've resolved to be annual, no, biennial. We'll go to that. But long conversations at the convention about that. Let's see. Every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualification requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. Okay, here's the franchise. And it's still the constitutional basis of our franchise. That our electoral basis in Iowa is according to how we elect members of the Iowa House. That determines our franchise. Now, that'll be altered some with the amendment that creates power of women to vote and the power of 18-year-olds to vote. Two amendments that affect, on the national level, affect voting rights, and to some degree by 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments after the Civil War, which bring blacks into the process. But you still get down to the fact that it's how you elect members to your state legislature, where not according to the Senate, not the Iowa Senate, it's the Iowa House that determines that for our state. It still is the constitutional basis. Now, and I said before, many of the states at this time you had to have property to vote. And that will change gradually over time. But it became, so we had in our country, there were some that were pretty democratic with respect to males over 21, even at this time. So you had this very varying franchise, which gradually over time has coalesced into roughly the same franchise from state to state. And yet we know that there are certain state governments that would like to further limit the number of people who can vote, or the number of people who are likely to vote, access to voting and so on. So we still play games with the franchise in our country. No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years and been 7 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of it, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of the state of which he shall be chosen. Excuse me. Double negative. All right. But it's important that you have to have residence in the state. Remember Hillary Clinton becoming a resident of New York, and New York, that became a huge issue when she was running for senator in New York. Is she really a New Yorker? Did she come from Arkansas and so on? But we have to establish residence. Now, why is that important? And why was it important to them? I think we can understand the reasons. You are more responsible to your constituents if you are a resident and you know more about their needs and so on. It's very different from the British pattern. And that makes a big difference in the politics of the country. In Great Britain, you can be a member of Parliament from Stoke and live in London and never have any residence whatsoever in Stoke. It's the way that the British party system enforces party discipline. If you're a good party member, you get a good, safe constituency. They always elect conservatives. But if you start deviating from the party, we'll give you that constituency up in Scotland that never elects a conservative, and you're out. Well, it does make a big difference, and it's an 1842 law. I mean, there's nothing here said about how the states will, how do you divvy up your representatives. It's going to be, as we'll see, you get one representative for every 30,000 people. The only time Washington is chairing the convention. That's important to the fact that the convention succeeds, that they have a convention. And the only time Washington is recorded in Madison's notes as having said anything is at the very end, when they're about ready to pass the Constitution, and it says 40,000 in it, and Washington speaks up and says, I think it should be 30,000. Immediately, they put 30,000 instead of 40,000. It's a little more representative if you have a smaller number of people involved. But we have 4 representatives in Iowa. Should we just have, all of us vote for all 4? A sort of preference system? Or, put, this is my first choice, this is my second, my third, and fourth choice. You could do it that way. But an 1842 law, which still obtains, it's a federal law that has affected the state, created single-member districts. So we now have single-member districts. And as we'll see in the Constitution, you determine every 10 years how those districts shall be drawn. Iowa is one of 4 states that draws them by an independent commission. Guess what? We have 2 Republicans and we have 2 Democrats. We're one of the most balanced states in the country, and that represents pretty much who we are. Whereas most states gerrymander. Gerrymander comes from the name of Elbridge Gerry, who was at the time, he's a member of the Constitutional Convention and a signer of the Constitution, who was in 1811 the governor of Massachusetts, and he redrew the electoral district that looked kind of like a salamander. So we get the word gerrymander from that. And we have lots of salamander districts now, and of course, and it's in the Tubin article a lot about how the power to make the district that in other words, the representatives can create the district they want. And then the primary election becomes much more important than the general election, because there's no way a member of your party won't be chosen from your particular district. So anyway, that's the way we've come, though it wasn't determined by the Constitution. Okay, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years and after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall by law direct. The number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative. Okay, and until such enumeration shall be made, the state of New Hampshire, and here's where we see the size of the states. New Hampshire shall be entitled to choose 3, Massachusetts 8, Rhode Island, Providence, Plantation 1, Connecticut 5, New York 6, New Jersey 4, Pennsylvania 8, Delaware 1, Maryland 6, Virginia 10, North Carolina 5, South Carolina 5, and Georgia 3. So that made up the original Congress. So there it is in our Constitution still. We see how they did it at the beginning. And did you hear the 3/5 clause? Notice the 3/5 clause? So, how are you going to count in the southern states? The slaves don't vote, but they're kind of people. They're 3/5 of a person. So you count the slave population, divide by 3/5, and you've got, it adds to the number of representatives from the southern states. They want that. Obviously, it increases their power in the House of Representatives to have the slaves counted as part of the population of the state. But the Northerners are not going to allow you to count as 1 person, 3/5 of a person. But you're also going to be taxed according to those 3. So it's a compromise. You're gonna have to pay for it in the tax structure. But at the beginning of the United States, there wasn't much of a tax from the federal government. Most of it comes from customs and tariffs and so on. Most of the federal funds come. So it isn't gonna play very largely until a little bit later when you begin to get more of a tax structure. But here is the first indication of slavery in the Constitution of the United States. It recognizes slavery. Nowhere does it say we promote slavery and we support slavery, but we recognize it. It's here, it's more or less here to stay. We'll see there's a slight concession to anti-slavery forces that appears in the Constitution. Okay, when vacancies happen in the representation from any state, the executive authority thereof shall issue writs of election and fill such vacancies. So the governor of the states appoints when you have an opening in Congress, either in the Senate or in the House. Remember what Rod Blagojevich in Illinois was trying to sell Obama's seat in the Senate. So, you know, it isn't as though it isn't possible to have some shenanigans around it. The House of Representatives shall choose their speaker and other officers and shall have sole power of impeachment. There it is, slipped in. And there's going to be quite a bit in the Constitution about impeachment. They're really worried about runaway executives. After all, the Articles of Confederation didn't allow it. They're bootlegging an executive into this process, but they're trying to surround it with lots of protection against tyranny. Their view is the source of tyranny is more often from the executive than anywhere else, especially if you build a Congress with divided powers. Okay, I think we can get through the Senate, and we'll see anyway. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof for the 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. It isn't until the early 20th century, as we'll see, that there's an amendment that allows popular election of senators. By the way, in Tubman, his article says that hasn't made much difference in the conservative nature of the Senate. But again, this is a concession to the states. We're not going to let the people vote for senators. We'll let the legislature of your state, who represent the people, vote for senators, choose the senators. So they're going to be chosen, and they were up until the early 20th century by the state legislatures. Immediately after they shall be assembled. Now, here's the issue of how you're going to work out terms for the senators. And this is a pretty astute, I think, compromise that they made. After they shall be assembled, in consequence of the first election, they shall be divided as equally as may be into 3 classes. The seats of the senators in the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the 2nd year. In other words, the first congressional election. So some of those senators have to be re-elected after 2 years. Now, you wonder, how did they work that out? Who's going to do it? But probably they felt pretty secure that the state legislatures would re-elect them. In the 2nd class at the expiration of the 4th year, and the 3rd class at the expiration of the 6th year. So you begin immediately to create a third of the Senate being elected every 2 years. And so from then on, that's the way we've done it. And if vacancies happen, resignation or otherwise, during the recess of the legislature or of any state, the executive thereof may make temporary appointments until the next meeting of the legislature, which will then fill such vacancies. So if you make the governor makes an executive appointment, it's only for 2 years. Then that Senate seat is open and has to be elected in the proper fashion. So the most you can get out of selling a Senate seat is 2 years, give a person 2 years. So that turned out not to be a very good bargain for Blagojevich, because he ended up going to jail for doing it. Okay, no person shall be a senator who shall not have attained the age of 30 years of age and been 9 years a citizen of the United States, shall not be elected when elected, be an inhabitant of that state for which he shall be chosen. Okay, so the senators, and notice that the residence issue and being a citizen. We're a nation of immigrants, and we certainly were then. And there were a lot of folks at this time who were relatively recent arrivals. And so you want someone who's been around a while as a citizen. They argued a lot about the citizenship of the president and finally decide that it has to be a naturalized, a born citizen. giving birth to the birthers in the current situation. In other words, if Barack Obama truly weren't born a citizen of the United States, he can't be president. And we know a lot of people believe that because of his Kenyan father and the way Hawaii is, something happened to make him an American citizen that was illegal, and he shouldn't be president. I've got a coffee cup at home, which has on one side a picture of Obama. It was given to me because I contribute to the Democratic Party. But a picture of Obama on one side and his birth certificate on the other. It says "Made in America." Okay, the Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided. So here we now have the one job provided by the Constitution for the Vice President. Nothing else, except to be next in line. That's in the Constitution as well. But you got one job. You're going to be the presider over the Senate, and you may get to vote once in a while. You can see why it sort of isn't worth the bucket of spit kind of comment could be made about the Vice Presidency. The Senate shall choose their other officers and also a President pro tempore. So the President pro tem of the Senate, in the absence of the Vice President, or when he shall exercise the office of the President of the United States. So he's going to be preside over the Senate if the Vice President is there. I don't know, and you people who watch C-SPAN, does the President pro tem usually preside? How often is the Vice President even there? I don't know. But I'm guessing that the President pro tem has a lot to do with it. There was a time when the President pro tem was third in line for the presidency. We'll get into that. I guess I'll just mention, having brought it up. Originally, it was going to be the Secretary of State. But then, in the late 1790s, as party politics began to really heat up, since Jefferson, the leader of the opponents of the Federalists, was the Secretary of State, they changed it to the President pro tem. The Congress changed it to the President pro tem in order to get Jefferson out of the line of succession. But then in 1886, I think it was, there was another law passed that put the Secretary of State back in number 3. Number 3, that's important, that could happen. 4 or 5 or 6, probably not. But, I mean, we've got our succession down to about 12 right now. But then in 1947, Harry Truman said, and I think he went to the Congress and said, it is not right for the President to be able to appoint his successor. The Secretary of State's appointed by the President. We should get the Secretary of State out of being so closely in the line. So in 1947, there was a Presidential Succession Act, which is still the act we have, which puts the Speaker of the House of Representatives third in line. So John Boehner is third in line. President pro tem of the Senate is fourth, and that's Leahy, I think. It's always the senior member of the Senate, I think Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And then number 5 is the Secretary of State. So John Kerry is number 5 in Vermont. But that's the way it is now. Okay, going back, I'm going to stop. So we'll stop right here. We'll go with the powers of the Senate, and then I think this will go a little quicker. I'm really planning to get through the Constitution and the bill and most of the amendments next time. So, Mary.
Ted Cruz over in Canada. He seems to think he can run for president. But he was born in Canada. You have to be a natural born.
You do.
So he cannot run for president.
But does he not have dual citizenship or something? I don't know. Yes, I think anyway there.
But still, that
His
doesn't
mother's an
say
American
you have dual
citizen.
citizenship.
And on this business of succession, remember Al Haig got himself in trouble because he said, "I'm okay. It's okay. I'm here. You know, I'm Secretary of State." Well, he wasn't in line, but he was putting himself forward anyway. All right. Thank you very much. We'll continue this next time.
Thank you very much, George. It's really hard to tell that George isn't a constitutional scholar. You can tell from the handouts today that you're going to be needing folders, and bring them back with your handouts each time. If you don't have one at home, and didn't get one today, there are still some out on the table, so feel free to pick one out. And thank you for coming early this morning. I think that'll be a good idea for you to do throughout this course, because you can tell we have a lot of people to get seated. So thank you for coming. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we hope to see you again next week.